that the world hasn't done a good job of recovering from the sovereign debt crisis. But so I would say that, they did quite well getting out of the first hole into which they found themselves. Not that well getting out of the second hole. Maybe it's quite difficult to get out of two holes if you're unlucky enough to get into one soon after you've got into the other. But looking back, what has been achieved? I just want to comment very lightly on a few things. See, first thing is that the G20, the work of the G20 is now pretty sharply divided between what is done under the finance track, which is all the stuff that leads up to the finance deputies, then goes to the finance ministers, and then comes to the heads of government, and then everything else, which is another track. And that one is sort of looked at primarily by the Sherpas and then the heads of government. The finance track is kept under very effective control by the finance ministries. Then they get together with the Sherpas one day before the summit, and the whole thing goes forward. Now, I think if you look at the pure finance track part of the whole process, then I would say that there are three very broad areas of work. One of them is clearly the whole business of creating an environment in which the major countries of the world can achieve a degree of macroeconomic coordination of policy. This is under the mutual assessment process and the framework for strong, sustainable growth. And the basic idea was that these countries should all get together and come to some agreement on how their policies should move. That's one. The second was the entire business of reform of the global financial system, meaning the banks and the quasi-banks and shadow banks and all of that. And the third was reform of the international financial system, meaning the IMF and the World Bank and the regional development banks. So these are three partitioned sort of windows. And very roughly, I would say that, it has been much more difficult, I would say, to actually achieve serious coordination of policy at the macroeconomic level. But, having said that, let's also recognize that this is not child's play. I mean, these are sovereign governments, and there are intense differences within those governments. Each of those governments has taken a position. Most of them, all the industrialized country governments, democratic governments, so whatever position they've taken is the position they've taken in a context of considerable domestic controversy. I mean, I don't know if somebody from the UK government is here. It was a good example. That in the UK, for example, the whole issue of whether the fiscal consolidation strategy was a good strategy to follow or whether it would lead to a little bit of an arresting of growth was intensely debated in the UK. And all kinds of people would be saying, no, this is the wrong thing to do, and others would be saying it's the right thing. So, if you think about it in a political process, the UK government actually decided to adopt a sort of fiscal conservative strategy. And were the leaders in Toronto, along with the Germans, that the time had come to move away from fiscal expansion, enough for fiscal expansion. This is the time to get back into the path of the path of the virtuous, and yes, there will be some short-term problems, etc., but we must do it. Now, many of us had some doubts that, at a time when there was so much private sector deleveraging taking place, is it really feasible or good to reduce public sector demand, and would that not lead to too much of a slowing down? And the answer to that actually was that, look, I mean, on the other side, that we're going to do a lot of structural reform. So the structural reforms will enthuse the private sector. So even though on the consumption side, private sector deleveraging would be taking place, on the fiscal side, there would be some conservatism. The structural reforms that would be undertaken would revive the investment spirits and lead to a great revival of demand. Now, actually, my judgment is that didn't happen. One can go into why it didn't happen. Was it too optimistic? Maybe they didn't do too much of reform, which is also true, et cetera, et cetera. But when these things were being discussed, I mean, we weren't collectively behaving like the IMF vis-a-vis each country. This kind of luxury of dictating whatever your view is there if you're the lender of last resort and the country is on its knees. And that's typically what happens in an IMF negotiation. I mean, you have to go with the judgment of the IMF because you need their money. And that's reasonable. In this case, it's a whole group of sovereign countries talking to each other. And my feeling is that we must recognize that the value of this is as much the rethinking that each country does, having heard the other country. And the impact of that rethinking is not actually felt in the meeting where this is taking place. It's felt in the next meeting 6 months later, because then everybody has a little bit more flexibility to have thought about it. And I would say that if you look at the global economy in the last 3 or 4 years, I mean, it's quite clear that the IMF has had to scale down its projections. I think the last 6 occasions, they've scaled down their projections of growth. I keep telling the Indian media when they criticize us that we're not the only ones who are doing this. And I think that reflects the fact that, the recovery is not the way the recovery to the first crisis was. But it is an infinitely more complicated set of things. And on the whole, I feel that it's been useful because what doesn't work gets thought about and reconfigured and spoken a little bit differently. I mean, for example, if you look at the sequence, it was in Toronto, 2010 or something, that they decided to give the signal that the time had come to do fiscal consolidation. In St. Petersburg, and even a little bit in Los Cabos last year, but certainly in St. Petersburg, the dominant message was fiscal consolidation over the medium term. In other words, nobody is recommending fiscal expansion, but that gung-ho business of going for fiscal consolidation as quickly as possible may not be the right thing. Some countries maybe can do more expansion than others. And so I think in a 2-year period, there has been a sort of a mutually agreed change of posture. How much you think this is valuable, you have to judge for yourself. I would say the Chinese, for example, the change of perception in China of economic policy has been actually very good in the sense that when the whole thing began, the Chinese, with a lot of justification, felt that they were being blamed for being the source of the imbalance, as if the world is fine, it's just the Chinese government is determined to run surpluses, and that's mucking up the system. And you can find lots of articles in 2008 that said that kind of thing. Actually, at that time, the argument was that while it's true that, I mean, we never took that view. We said there are lots of imbalances. But one of the issues was that the Chinese exchange rate should actually appreciate. The Chinese were not very willing to accept that at that time. But actually, over the last few years, it has appreciated. And secondly, the argument that pushing for high growth is not going to be sustainable if others can't run the large deficit. That has also got reflected in Chinese policy in the sense that the Chinese growth rate is now down to, I mean, they're projecting 7.5%. From a period when growth was in 10+% levels. So I think that over time, this process of discussion has led to, on the part of each country, a better understanding of how the world's going to evolve and what other countries are going to do. But it's wrong to call it coordination. I mean, it's not that everybody sits down and says, I'm going to expand, you're going to deflate, you're going to do this, I'm going to do this. But a sort of a broad understanding of how the world is moving. So I would say that it's better to have it than not to have it. And I think if you tried to get the same outcome by just doing it in the General Assembly of the UN, I don't think you'd get anything like a comparable meeting of minds. These are the 20 countries which have whatever 75% of the world's GDP. And it's quite useful for them to be getting together. So that's so much on the policy coordination. You know, on the question of what the financial sector, how to make the financial sector more stable, I think a lot of work has been done. The Financial Stability Forum, which used to be a somewhat select group of countries, didn't include any developing countries, was expanded into the Financial Stability Board, which now has all the G20 countries as members. And they have actually laid out quite an extensive program of financial sector reform, beginning with Basel III, but going on to lots of other things. This is largely a work in progress. It's not finished. But, you know, I'm not aware that anybody's getting up and saying, oh, this is the wrong way to go. I think one of the things we in India and other developing countries are saying is, look, we agree this is the way to go, but you've got to do it in a manner that doesn't become discriminatory, in the sense that the new prudential rules should not be operating to the disadvantage of developing countries, which they easily could. So I think those kinds of issues are now being discussed, and I would say the world is a better place for having the Financial Stability Board lay out this longer-term path for financial sector reforms. Another area is, of course, the reform of the international institutions, the IMF and the World Bank. Now, there's sort of agreement that, you know, you need to improve the voting share, et cetera, of the developing countries. And if the 14th quarter review actually got implemented, there would be a change, and the number of seats that the Europeans have on the IMF board would be reduced. But that has yet to be ratified. I mean, what that really means is that everybody except the US has ratified it. So the moment the US ratifies it, it goes into effect. I'm no forecaster. In the St. Petersburg meeting, the leaders said it must be ratified as soon as possible so that we can get on with the 15th quarter review and complete that by January. But, you know, if you read the American newspapers, the chances of congressional ratification for that are very low at the moment. So basically, this is something where the G20 will miss a deadline, primarily because, not that the US administration doesn't want it, but they just say, look, realistically, we can't get it through Congress. But at least while there's a delay, that restructuring is kind of sort of happening. A last area in the economic side, the pure finance sort of economic side, is really development. Because in Seoul, people looked at the agenda and said, this is all driven by the instability that has been caused by the 2008 crisis. But there's a much bigger issue of development also that's on the agenda. And several parts of which are related to development were identified. You know, my feeling is that a lot of that is really giving good advice to countries about things they have to do themselves. And I mean, all that advice is good. Transparency and, you know, you've got to strengthen your own agriculture, et cetera, all good stuff. Have more rational energy prices and so on. But really the question that one has to ask oneself is that the G20 can only add value if it brings international collaboration to bear in pushing an agenda. I mean, otherwise we're just sitting around telling each other what a good economics 101 course would teach us. And there is one item on the agenda that India has been pushing, Indonesia has been pushing, some other countries also. And that is that in a world which is lacking global demand, it's a no-brainer and a win-win situation for everybody if we can promote investment in infrastructure in developing countries. I mean, that will generate global demand and lots more imports, so it's not as if the developing countries would be the only ones benefiting from the demand. It would obviously increase their supply capability in the medium run. It'll give a boost to growth. And at a point when it is very difficult to identify good demand items to push, this seems to be a somewhat obvious one. And here, the debate within the G20 is really Everybody agrees with this, by the way. In St. Petersburg, even the industrialized countries said we must spend more on infrastructure. I mean, President Obama said, you know, United States must spend more on infrastructure. Of course, developing countries must spend more. The real question was, what can the international community do? And I think here the discussion focuses on two different kind of paths. One is saying that, look, if you want a lot of foreign investment, private sector investment in infrastructure, there's a lot of private money